Wow, I ran out of space. Had to delete some videos, so now we're on the third part of this. Where was I? Madison believed by building checks on power into the structure of government, as the new Constitution did. So, since the new government was one of limited powers, it did not have powers that weren't mentioned in the Constitution. That meant there was no need to say, for example, that Congress could not interfere with freedom of speech. Since Congress wasn't explicitly given that power, it obviously could not interfere with freedom of speech. Indeed, bills of rights could do no more harm than good if they implied that the people had only the rights they listed. The rights unmentioned were not rights at all. Politically, however, it was a big blunder not to combine a Bill of Rights with the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists who opposed ratification of the Constitution had a substantial arsenal of arguments to show that the Constitution would undermine, not save, Republican government. Republican government, not democratic government. That it was essentially a step back to all the Americans, a step back to all the Americans had rejected in 1776, monarchy. But they seldom failed to mention the lack of a Bill of Rights. Several states combined their ratification of the Constitution with a list of amendments that they thought should be enacted once it went into effect. Those lists always included provisions protecting basic rights. Without the device of recommending amendments, it is doubtful whether the Constitution would have been adopted. Indeed, Virginia's ratification resolution included a statement that, quote, no right of any denomination can be canceled, abridged, restrained, or modified by the new federal government, quote, except in those instances in which power is given by the Constitution for those purposes, and that among other essential rights, the liberty of conscience and of the press cannot be canceled, abridged, restrained, or modified by any authority of the United States, unquote. It also declared that the powers granted under the Constitution could be resumed by the people, quote, whensoever the same shall be perverted to their injury or oppression, unquote. Virginians obviously had very little confidence in the new Constitution. Anti-Federalist sentiment in Virginia was, in fact, so strong that Madison failed to win a place in the Senate. He settled for a seat in the House of Representatives, but to get that, he had to assure the voters that he would support amendments to the Constitution. The wisdom in conciliating the Constitution's opponents seemed to him reason enough to do that. An exchange of letters with Thomas Jefferson, then the American minister in Paris, who argued strongly for a Bill of Rights, also softened Madison's opposition. And so on June 8, 1789, Madison moved in the first federal Congress that, quote, a declaration be, quote, prefixed to the Constitution. That prefix, which seems to have constituted what Madison called a Bill of Rights, would say that all power is originally vested in and consequently derived from the people. That government is instituted and ought to be exercised for the benefit of the people, which consists in the enjoyment of life, liberty, with the right of acquiring and using property, and generally of pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. That the people have an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform or change their government whenever it be found adverse or inadequate to the purpose of its institution. This is why I advocate not voting. Right now, we have an anti-constitutional, anti-people corporate government. Money, power, plutocratic, rule by wealth government, long-standing, going back to the Federal Reserve Act passage of 1913. We have a right to abolish the government that's not serving us as the people. We must do this, and we must stop participating in the elections, giving the system as it is its life. and consenting to it by voting. You're giving consent to an unconstitutional, anti-people government. That's what you're doing. This is not my opinion. This is what is. Wake up, America. Read these documents. Get copies of these documents and stop participating. Not out of apathy, but out of integrity and out of a desire to address this abominable corporate state we have, a police state, which will inevitably completely overturn all of our rights if we don't stop it now. Not only that, the whole entire biosphere will be our habitat will not support us in probably 10 years. That might be a long estimate. If we don't stop this criminal, corporate, fascistic state. Like I said, and it's not this current administration that's the only sign of this. It's going back. The Obama administration was also corporate, fascistic. More Wall Street representatives in Obama's cabinet than Bush before him. And Obama did not, as Oliver Stone points out very clearly, Obama did nothing but carry forth the Bush program, the Zionist, anti-American, anti-constitutional program. Madison also proposed making a long list of changes in the body of the Constitution. For example, he wanted the provision on representation in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 changed, so it would no longer say that the number of representatives, quote, shall not exceed one for every 30,000, unquote, which one anti-federalist after another condemned as a violation of the people's right to full and free representation in Congress. And he wanted Article 1, Section 6, Clause 1 to say that no law increasing the compensation of representatives could take effect before another election had taken place. More important, he proposed inserting into Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which imposed restrictions on Congress's powers, provisions protecting several basic rights, including freedom of religion, of speech, and of the press. The rights of assembly and of petition, the right to bear arms, and a series of rights in criminal prosecutions. His proposals would specifically forbid excessive bail, quote, cruel and unusual punishments, unquote, quote, unreasonable searches and seizures, unquote, warrants issued without probable cause, and the deprivation of, quote, life, liberty, or property without due process of law, unquote. Madison also wanted a statement that, quote, no state shall violate the equal rights of conscience or the freedom of the press or the trial by jury in criminal cases, added to Article 1, Section 10. What Madison proposed was not what the country got. The Federalists who dominated the first federal Congress saw no reason to change the Constitution so soon, and in any case considered other issues as far more urgent. The Constitution, after all, left a lot of institution designing to the new government itself. Congress, for example, had to work out the details of the new federal judiciary, and also the executive branch and the relation of cabinet officers, about which the Constitution said nothing, to the legislature. Finally, on September 28, 1789, after Madison's proposal was revised by the House, the Senate, and a conference committee, Congress sent to the states for ratification 12 proposed amendments. They would be listed at the end of the Constitution because Representative Roger Sherman of Connecticut insisted that Congress could not alter the body of the Constitution, which had been ratified by the people. Congress, with the consent of 3/4 of the states, could enact as legislative acts only those amendments that were, quote, detached from the Constitution and supplementary to it. That, however, made the new amendments look like afterthoughts, which of course they were. Then the states approved only 10 of the 12 amendments, rejecting the first 2 on Congress's list, one concerned with representation, the other, which was finally enacted in 1992 as the 27th Amendment, saying that any change in the compensation paid to senators and representatives could take effect only after an election intervened. The 10 became, in December 1791, the Federal Bill of Rights, a bare-bones lawyer's list of rights with 2 additional provisions. The Ninth Amendment declared that the previous statement of rights, quote, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, unquote. The 10th Amendment said that powers which the Constitution did not delegate to the United States or prohibit to the states were, quote, reserved to the states respectively, or to the people, unquote. The Federal Bill of Rights lacked any of the natural rights flourishes so common in the state documents. Nor did it include any of the structural changes in the federal government that anti-federalists wanted. Checks on federal taxation power, for example, or the creation of a special executive council to assume the Senate's role in advising and consenting to various executive actions. And not everyone was happy with it. The Bill of Rights, one congressman complained, was little better than, quote, whip syllabub, unquote, a popular 18th century dessert. Quote, froth and full of wind, formed only to please the palate, or they are like a tub thrown out to a whale, unquote, at sea to divert it from doing damage to a ship, and so, quote, secure the freight of the ship and its preachable voyage, unquote. What, in fact, did the Bill of Rights do? On that, Madison's proposal was reasonably clear. Some provisions restricted Congress, others the states. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, as enacted, said, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, unquote. But no subsequent amendment began in the same way. Instead, subsequent amendments were written as general edicts. The Second Amendment, for example, said, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, unquote. If the amendments were part of the Constitution, which was, quote, the supreme law of the land, Article 6, all such general principles should have been binding on the states as well as on the federal government. Indeed, one argument for a federal Bill of Rights lay in its capacity to remedy the inconsistency in state laws by providing a general uniform foundation for Americans' basic rights. But in 1833, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, decided, in the case of Barron versus the Mayor of Baltimore, that the Federal Bill of Rights restricted only the federal government. Even there, it didn't prove particularly effective. In the late 1790s, for example, when the Federalists passed a sedition law that seemed clearly to violate the First Amendment, the courts did not interfere, in part because the judges were almost entirely Federalists. In any case, in the early republic, not democracy, republic, the people of the sun, the federal government remained substantially less significant than the states, so checking its already insubstantial authority was not a critical function. Immediately after its enactment, in short, the Federal Bill of Rights, if not forgotten, as the Declaration of Independence had been, was anything but a revered and important document. Its resurrection, in fact, turned in a curious way on the history of the Declaration of Independence, which began its rise from obscurity soon after the Bill of Rights was ratified. Since neither the federal Constitution nor the Bill of Rights said anything about men being born or created equal or having inalienable or unalienable rights, persons who continued to believe in the relevance of those ideas and who found them useful in national politics had to cite the Declaration of Independence. It was all they had. And so in the 1790s, that old revolutionary manifesto began a rather dramatic comeback. Members of the, quote, Republican Party, unquote, began celebrating it as the work of Thomas Jefferson, one of their leaders. That it had some distant resemblance to France's Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789, didn't hurt either. The Republicans were friends of France and its revolution, while Federalists turned sour on France after the execution of Louis XVI and the onset of the Terror. And when the Republicans quoted the Declaration of Independence, their citations came not from the last paragraph, but the second, the one that said all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights. We got to stop there. Bill of Rights, freedom. Let freedom ring. Stop voting. Boycott elections.